Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Sue Yendel, for this amazing presentation and this amazing overview of what happened in the last 50 years. It is a very humbling opportunity for me to be hosting our panel. Apologies. My name is Lucas Hofstetter. I am the Manager Research and Development here at CKE New South Wales. In this capacity, I am very humbled to sort of try to continue from the great beginnings through our own research, but also through organizing events like this as part of the Care Knowledge Exchange. Today, we have a session that will explore how care research and lived experience have informed policy reform, service development, and future directions for the sector, while also reflecting on the work that still needs to happen to improve outcomes for carers. I'm very pleased to welcome our panelists today. Professor Michael Flyne, Professor Emeritus at Macquarie University with a long-standing career in social policy, aging, care, and human services research. He's a member of the Carers New South Wales. He's contributed to a range of initiatives and has been a long-time member of the Carers New South Wales Advisory Council and has really dedicated his academic life to improving outcomes for all the people and carers. Welcome, Michael. Our second speaker will be Professor Irene Blackberry. She's a health services and implementation science researcher with expertise in improving care systems for older people and carers. Her work focuses on care delivery, virtual care, technology, and the use of data to improve outcomes across the care sector. Welcome, Irene. Our third and final speaker, and an important voice on this panel, is Alex Lee, a long-term collaborator in the Care Knowledge Exchange and with Carers New South Wales as a voice for carers. He is a carer himself for over 20 years. He has navigated systemic barriers and disadvantage against carers. Today, Alex uses his experiences in peer support, systems advocacy, and facilitating education about carer recovery. Welcome, Alex. I would like to ask for Michael to kick us off with his reflections around 50 years of Carers New South Wales, what has been done and what still needs to happen.
Good. Okay. Great. Well, looks like I'm on. Can you hear me? You can hear me. That's good. That's good. Look, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to participate in the event today. I'm very honoured, and I think this is a very important event. And congratulations, just to start with, to Carers New South Wales and to Carers Australia for reaching this milestone. I think that's a remarkable achievement, and many organisations don't last 50 years, don't last 5 years these days. So to see just the strength of this organisation has been quite inspiring, and to also see the achievements that we've experienced over the period of 50 years has also been very significant. And I think we perhaps, without indulging ourselves in a sort of self-righteous celebration of aren't we good, I think it is important that we actually acknowledge how successful it's been and how important an organisation it is, and think of ways to look forward. And Sharon, I really welcome you to the position. We're very glad to have you now leading Carers New South Wales. You follow in the tracks of some great and amazing people, and I'm sure you're going to be adding to that tradition of leadership. It's just wonderful to hear your introduction today. So just let me clarify, I've got about 15, 20 minutes. Lucas, is that long?
More like 10, 15.
10, 15. Okay. All right. Well, I'll move fairly quickly through it, but I think it would be foolish if I don't, if you would excuse me just being a little bit indulgent. I actually knew Claire Stevenson and I had the opportunity to meet her in the early 1980s. But I first discovered her work in 1976, which was my first year out of university, and I was part of a research project. I managed to get a job, you might say. My first job was as a um, researcher with the Australian Assistance Plan, and that was developed under the Whitlam government, but it was continued. They allowed the funding to run under the Fraser government, which was 1976 and 77. The Australian Assistance Plan still ran, and there was a research project I was involved with looking at the um, needs of the population in this case, it was southwest Sydney, and it covered about 6 municipalities from Marrickville through to Hurstville, Rockdale, Cogra, Canterbury municipalities. And I was doing research into the needs of older people, discovering that there were lots of needs, but there were virtually no services. There were nursing homes and not much else. And I was doing through my phone, through my visits, it was a, participant observation study. I'd visit nursing homes, I'd visit whatever services we could find and so forth. And I came across this piece of work that was being launched by Claire and by Avril Fink through the Council on the Ageing, which became the Dedication Report. That was published early the next year. Dedication was based on written surveys and of people who were carers, as we heard from Sue Yendall. It was based on initially a study of the daughters of older people who were receiving care from the daughter. But many others started to be circulated beyond that, and quite a number of other overlooked carers were identified. So spouse carers, both male and female, a few males who weren't the partners of the care recipient, and a few others also participated. And they not only answered a number of questions which had very fixed answers, but they also provided extensive text, describe your day, and what are outline the tasks you do, what are the difficulties that you face, what are the things that you have missed or foregone. Um, and the responses were extremely moving and powerful. And it's why I think that it was important that it became such an important and, as I was amazed to hear that cited, prophetic and foundational. And I'm glad to see it's getting a little bit of recognition. And Sue's new book helps renew that recognition. It was a very important study for setting up New South Wales Carers. New South Wales Carers was set up a full decade before Carers Australia. New South Wales Carers was a product initially of the Council of the Ageing in New South Wales. Avril Fink was very fully engaged, as was Claire Stevenson. Just let me tell you a little bit more about Claire. She was quite an amazing woman. You can find a lot more detail about her, and I recommend reading it actually. It's a good read. It's quite a good but brief account in Wikipedia. Claire Stevenson with a V, Stevenson. And she was really important. I always thought she was with the Australian Land Army in the Second World War, but she was with the WAF, the Women's Australian Air Force. And her activities in the Women's Australian Air Force was quite remarkable. But she came there having already had quite an illustrious career from a company that she worked with before the war and after the war. And I think it's both an amazing story of what she did there. She became an executive, but initially was introduced as a trainee, and she worked for Burley. Burley, as you know, make bras and other foundational garments, as they used to call them. We might call them lingerie these days, but I suppose you might say that Claire learned a lot about support in that particular job. And she was extremely interesting and formidable. She took on a number of amazing tasks during the Second World War, and most of the entry that she has in her awards that she was received from the government came from her work during the Second World War, um, were about very daring things that she undertook. She really was a sort of a leading, you could say, a feminist, but a very effective manager and a very effective um, person. So after the war, she went back to working with Burley until she retired. When she retired, she actually worked with Meals on Wheels, because it was pre the date of Meals on Wheels being effectively established. She worked as a volunteer with a number of services and came to work with Council on the Aging and produced this amazing study. I met her in the 1980s, and she and I were on a couple of were on a committee together anyway, one in particular I remember, and I was a young man of about 26, 28. I'd returned from Holland where I'd been studying, and I'd worked in a Dutch nursing home doing an ethnography of the Dutch nursing home. So I'd been doing the training that's required to become a Dutch assistant or applied nurse is probably the best term to translate it as. And I thought the Dutch system was quite amazing. And I came back to Australia, and our nursing homes were a complete disgrace. They were overcrowded and shocking. And we were on a committee that was involved with improving aged care policy. But Claire was really a sort of mentor to me, a friend and a mentor, and just really encouraged me. She was a sort of, call her a kindred soul. She taught me a lot about meeting procedure and how you make effective campaigns. And to this day, I really find that very inspiring. And I'm very grateful of the opportunity that I had to meet her. And also, I might say I've also met a number of other amazing women and quite a number of men through the whole community care programs and community organisations and groups that have been really inspiring, and we can learn a lot from all of that. It's given me a lot of inspiration. Now, why do I think it's important? Because I think Claire, Claire's work picked up a sort of you could say it was a vibe at the time towards social change. It was still looking back at it, still in the sort of tails of the introduction of the welfare state and social policy in the post-World War II period. And there was a sort of an optimism there that it was the neglect of populations, the rise of poverty, the exploitation, and just absence of support for people, for very large sections of the population, not just in Germany or in Europe, but in Australia, in the United States, in Canada and New Zealand, but around in Japan, around the world. That had led to the Second World War, and we saw the introduction of a whole range of measures, like from the United Nations and the Charter of Human Rights, right through to the development of programs such as unemployment support, provide the concept of the right to work. We never had the right to work in the 19th century, and people would have thought that was crazy. But now, if you couldn't have a job, you had a right to gain financial support in Australia and around the world. But there were a number of areas that were left out of that picture. And we started to see the development of what sociologists have called social movements. And I believe that carers movement needs to be thought of as a international social movement. And like all international social movements, there are special sort of hotspots, key places where things grew. Britain was one of those places. Britain really picked up the issue that as they developed a national health service, for example, the National Health Service set the standard for the whole world for the development of free access to health care. And there was aged care sort of had its birth in the period after the Second World War also, as hospitals moved from being sort of long stay institutions to become short-term specialised institutions. And that's very much linked to antibiotics and modern surgical techniques and modern interventions, even radiotherapy and so forth. They wanted to turf the old people out of hospitals, and many of them ended up back at home. And who cared for them? The family. And it was completely no support given whatsoever to the family. We started to see the beginning of nursing homes developing them, and much of the time, the nursing home development in Australia for more than 10 years, from 1950s to the 1960s, nursing homes developed without a cent of government support. They were private initiatives. A lot of them were just run by private developers. Some were produced by doctors, others by individuals who saw an investment opportunity as a sort of running like a boarding house. Just became, well, we'll put in a couple of more assistants to help people in there, and they just grew up as nursing homes, and most of them were pretty horrific places if we now look back at them. We also saw a number of places developed by churches, Church of England, the Catholic Church, Presbyterian, and uh, Baptist churches, and other denominations, Jewish movements and so forth, developed services too. It wasn't until the 1960s that we started to see support for aged care developing, but still there were these people at home who'd had to give up their whole life to care for, by giving up their whole life. I mean, they didn't have a chance of having a job. They didn't have a chance to do other things. They had to give up their daily life to provide the care to family members. There were people that we often used the term maiden aunts for. They were wives. There was this whole idea that women actually shouldn't be working. And so there was, when women used to work in the 1950s, they were accepted in the workplace until they were married. And once they were married, they were usually banned from work. And this was just across the world. And this continued. By the 1970s, we started to do things differently. And this came about because of further the expansion of the welfare state, as I've said, but also the response of politics and political movements. We started to see the civil rights movement in the United States, and that spread around the world, including to Australia, to demand rights for Indigenous populations and people of colour. We saw the abolition of the White Australia policy. We actually gave Aboriginal people the right to vote in 1967 as a result of a huge, massive movement across Australia, led by Aboriginal people, but also by supportive, informed white people, who felt that it was wrong that Aborigines didn't have the right to have citizenship. So they were allowed to have citizenship and given the right to vote in 1967. Now we can see the sort of emergence of social movements, and probably the most important, apart from that of civil rights, has been feminism, but also sexuality. So the gay and lesbian, and we know the whole alphabet these days of sexuality. We've seen the environment movement, how important that is. And I see the carers movement as being in that tradition and in that field. It's a movement that has its sort of two levels. It has the local and national and international components that are in the public sphere, but it's also about acknowledging the change within individuals. People, when they participate in a social movement, actually start to learn more about the circumstance and the problems that they're facing, and they adapt and change their behaviour. And the carers movement has worked in that sense too, of trying to help people understand that they're not alone. And that's why I think the most important first step, you could say, has been the acknowledgement of carers. And we've seen the acknowledgement of carers initially through, as Sue just pointed out, in Australia, through their recognition in legislation, initially through the home and community care legislation that was introduced in 1985 under a Labor government. And also we saw then the other various carers recognition acts of the early 2000s. We've had a lot of hope for those, and they've delivered somewhat, but we wonder how far have they progressed? What might we be doing beyond that? The carers uh, movement in Australia, particularly Carers New South Wales, but Carers Australia also, and the development of the carers movement in other states, has been at the forefront of all of that. It's interesting to see, just a slight comment on this, that the reason we needed a Carers Australia because the Commonwealth Government in 1985, under the Home and Community Care Act, had recognised carers as a needs group and recognised the work that they did, but that was as far as it went. But they had a policy which involved a negotiation. It was a sort of corporatist policy that required things to be negotiated between government, business, then the trade unions and community groups that were related to it. And they didn't have a partner to speak with at federal level. And they said, well, where is the Carers Australia? And well, why should there be a Carers Australia? We had Carers New South Wales, and there was by then a Carers Victoria and South Australia, and I think most states had them, but there wasn't a Carers Australia. And so it was through the initiative of the Commonwealth Government, their support for it, that we saw then Carers Australia developed. So we might think of this sort of idea of carers movement being natural, and yet in some ways it sits quite differently to many of the other social movements. Many of the social movements we think of, say, civil rights movement, the environment movement, are sort of anti-establishment movements, almost radical social movements, calling for drastic social reform. The carers movement is based on sort of recognition of traditional values in a sense, the traditional value of the family, the importance of care within the families, but also it's got this element of feminism a very strong element of feminism. And there's a little bit of a sort of friction, you might say, between the sort of radicalism of feminism and this traditional family view. In some senses, that's been manifested, and it continues to be manifested in the ways in which we think about carers and the carers recognition questions. And I think that's where I would like to finish my talk, just discussing this issue for a moment. So, what I think has been a question is that we've been always thinking, what is the next step for the carers movement? Where do we go? We've talked in vague language about partnerships. Now, I think that we need to be thinking of the way that what I call the social division of care. Care is no longer just a responsibility within the family. And important as it is that we acknowledge the dominant workforce in this field and the dominant movements in this field have been women, men also are important. Okay, men also provide care. We start to think a bit broadly, a bit more broadly. We start to think of self-care. Can you actually care for yourself? Is that just a sort of a neoliberal demand, a sort of way of government shrinking back its responsibilities, or is that a reality? Do we have what is our rights? What are our rights to self-care that are different from just this sort of consumer-driven idea of a market where we can purchase different products and make choices? So I think that one of the big challenges that we need to confront is how we might develop that concept. So I think we need to go beyond acknowledging this sort of dichotomy and start to think of this partnership, as the Toronto conference put it, as Sue Yandel just spoke, a partnership in care. So we don't need to think about just the carers at home doing all the work on their own or the services doing it. Services can hardly operate these days without carers. We think in particular of the importance of, say, coordinating care work, or the sort of idea of running your own NDIS program for people with disabilities. Somebody's going to have to make sure that the payments are made. Someone has got to make sure that when one care worker rings in and says, I can't make it today, I'm sick, or I've got another job, or I've had an accident on the way to work, someone else can come instead. So the act of coordination is a sort of an ongoing and very demanding piece of work. We've got to get rid of this idea of either it's carers or it's formal services. We have to start working with a vision of a sort of a partnership that it covers this division of labour that goes right through from intimate family relationships, draws in men. I think that's very essential that we try to draw men into caring. Men will care, and the statistics support that very strongly for people aged over the age of 67. Once you're in retirement age, men contribute to care in much higher proportions than when they're of working age, um, etc. We need to go beyond that. And I think we also need to think of how we work with the rest of the care economy. That's another major development that we've seen in the last 20 years. And the concept of a care economy also comes out of this feminist care research that has been so important and transformative for the carers movement. But and we saw it. I'm very proud of the way in which the Labor government in Australia really took the idea of the care economy and said, well, that means that we've got to pay workers in services a decent wage. We can't have them earning less than if they're working in a supermarket. They ought to earn at least the minimum wage. They ought to earn more than that. And we've seen wages for nurses, we've seen wages for care workers increase, if not to where they should be, at least a lot better. And I think you think of the way in which people like Katie Gallagher and our Governor General and other people have been speaking about the care economy. They've really used this very well. One way we need to think about this is what rights do people have to get access to services? It shouldn't be, well, if you've got a carer, you won't need services. How can you get access? And I'm focused very much on aged care at the moment, and I've been really advocating for the development of a primary care approach to the provision of care through the Commonwealth Home Support Program. So a primary aged care program means that you access services quite directly, just as you go to the general practitioner. You don't need to go first of all to an assessment program to assess whether you need to go to the doctor. You just go to the doctor and the doctor works it out herself or himself. So we need to think of aged care being primary care, but we need to think of it also as being, like all care, having a goal of really helping a person manage their own life as much as possible. So we need to develop this program well beyond the way in which it's functioned in the past to enable it to be preventative and supportive in many other ways. I think that there's a lot to celebrate, in short, but there's also still challenges ahead. And I congratulate Carers New South Wales on today on this 3-day opportunity to really reflect on this and all the strategic movements that we've had. And I look forward to hearing further discussion on these issues in the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. There were some really great points for the discussion afterwards. Before we delve into discussing the points in its final notion, we move on to our next speaker. Irene, thank you very much for your contribution. I will bring up your slide.
Well, thank you very much, obviously, Carers New South Wales, for inviting me to speak and share, some of my research and others, in the past 50 years. So I'm going to focus on the past, present, and future, probably a little bit less on the past. I think we've heard a lot, from Sue and from Michael, and I think, it really gives a nice, I guess, background that on my talks today. Next slide, please, Lucas. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodian of the land that we're meeting today, and I'm joining you from the land of the Wiradjuri people. I live in Albury, but also to pay respects to elders past and present, and also colleagues who's joining us here online. Next slide, please. So 3 things that I'm going to focus on today is about, where are we now? Obviously, taking a glimpse of, what's happening in the past. Also looking into what are the impacts of the care research in particular. And, I will take a much more broad brush, I guess, in terms of the care research. And also thinking about, what still needs to be done. So next slide, please. So I guess what we're seeing at the moment is the growing demand and also reliance on informal care. So you can see the growing demand on care not only to do with the aging populations, but also obviously as we live longer, you see a lot of, I guess, increase in the number of chronic conditions. And I mentioned about the increasing reliance on unpaid carers, and then I will talk a bit more about it, in terms of giving you an insight into that. So carers are definitely essentials, but often overlooked as part of the whole system, the bigger system. So this is the care economy system that Michael mentioned about. So this is where my research has been focusing on in the last 6 years. So the graph in there sees, the number of people over the age of 50 and above providing informal care. So you can see that people who are delivering care on a daily basis, but you also see people who are delivering care on a weekly basis. And this is a snapshot, if you like, across various countries. Next slide, please. So in terms of, I guess, if I want to summarize, I guess, the evolution of the care research in terms of the contribution, the early research focus in the 1970s and 80s, that Sue and Michael, have touched on in a much more in-depth, is about, caregiving was seen as a familial duty. There's a limited policy focus, and the research, some of the early research in the 1980s in particular, highlighting the issues around stress in terms of, whilst, it's, I guess, has a beneficial effect or impact in terms of, delivering care to the loved ones, but also in the higher dose, it can create stress. By the 1990s and 2000s, we see through research that, there's a what we call a caregiver burden or caregiver demand. And there is an increase, I guess, in the number of support services, for example, respite care and counseling as a result of that. And then the other part, I guess, that, we see from the 2010s is about, carers being acknowledged as a care partners. And also, we also see the economic evaluation of their unpaid role to become more prominent. And so most recently, what we see is that, research actually using this systems thinking, we see the increase in terms of the digital health and a much more equity focus in terms of addressing the diverse caregiver needs and experiences. Next slide, please. So this is, I guess, the part that, in response to what you mentioned, Michael, about, about care is about, looking at the care, as part of the care ecosystem. I know we talk about it, and this is part of, the research that I'm focusing on in the last 6 years. To actually understand care being a relational dynamic and the long term, and also understanding that, care occurs over the life course. A lot of people see care, as being quite focused. People see care as being, self-care or individual, as you can see on the left-hand side there. But, we do need to take a much more, I guess, a global focus or a much more comprehensive focus is that, you live or we live, not alone. We live within an ecosystem. So this is based on the ecological model that, we are living, around friends, communities. We have formal care services. We have the care system, but we are also governed by the funding policy and regulations and also culture of the care. At the same time, when we did the scoping systematic review, we also proposed this care ecosystem framework. And the reason why it's not a clear, I guess, like a rounded shape is that, to understand that, care is not a linear program. You will have the ups and downs. You will see the bumps, along the way. And there are so many key components of care, that can provide a mechanism. So this is a system approach. There are also some guiding principles as to how care is being delivered. There are also some care components. So all of them are interplay at the various sectors, various intersection. Next slide, please. So in terms of, I guess, the carer outcomes, we see the health impacts on carers. So carers, as I mentioned, face higher risks of depression, anxiety, sleep problems, chronic stress, especially when there is an increase in terms of the intensity and also the number of hours required to deliver the care. Economic consequences. So caregiving leads to reduced workforce participation, absenteeism, and income loss, but also disproportionately affecting women. So there's also often carers experience this social isolation, particularly in the rural areas where I do a lot of my work. Is there's a strong stigma associated with being a carer, reduced participation socially, also strained relationships due to the caregiving demands. And carers also enhance, on the other side, I guess, enhance the care continuity, safety, and patient outcomes through intimate knowledge and personalized care. Next slide, please. In terms of the impact on policy and practice, both Sue and Michael mentioned a lot about legislation. So you can see that, not only in terms of the rights, but also some of the national strategies, not just in Australia, but also worldwide. Research also informed the creation of carer assessments, respite services, and education programs, across the care frameworks. We also, through research, being able to promote carers as a partner. And this is, for example, in discharge planning, in chronic disease management, and also more recently in end-of-life care. Workforce has been mentioned quite a bit, and I think, it is an important and growing area. So the research highlights the need for flexible work, carers leave, and also income support for carers in employment policies. Next slide, please. In terms of some of the persistent gaps and system challenges that we could see is under identification of carers. So many carers, remain unidentified, particularly within the health or social care system, and thus, missing these crucial support opportunities. Culturally diverse, Indigenous, and also rural carers often lack equitable access to care services. And the health, aged care, and social services, as we know, within the care economy, they always operate in silos. We have fragmented systems, not only in terms of the system itself, how it is governed and run, but also in terms of the policies and, more importantly, funding. So people need to access, various different fundings, just to address, the care needs, even in one person. So workforce shortages, is happening everywhere, in Australia, and particularly in the rural, remote area. And there is, with unlimited evidence, we know that, there's an intervention outcomes, that it's actually increased carers' burden. So the more prominent the workforce shortages, then, the more the care is actually being shouldered by informal carers or caregivers. Next slide, please. So I mentioned about the carer identification gaps, so in terms of the health and social care sectors, the system largely focus on care recipients. So they're not focusing on the caregivers or the carers being the partners into the care delivery. Carers also are not routinely identified or assessed still, and this is happening across the care sectors, in my care economy research. And more importantly, many carers or caregivers do not identify themselves as being carers. So when we do run research, with carers, it's very hard to actually recruit carers because they don't see themselves as being a carers. They see themselves as, this is part of my life. Next slide, please. So I mentioned about the system reality, there are so many systems, and everything is in silos, as you can see, the healthcare, social care, and so on. So the care systems depend substantially on informal carers, as what Michael mentioned. It won't happen by itself. The care and support services remain difficult to navigate, as we know, and continue to be fragmented. Aged care policy emphasizes support to remain at home, but at the same time, as we heard, lately, that, the waiting list is about 12 months to access this support at home. So that means that, the informal carers will need to continue to shoulder the care. So carers often complement the formal services and, as I mentioned, help absorb these gaps in care delivery. Next slide, please. So I look a lot on the economic role of carers. So we know obviously about the unpaid care, providing a substantial economic input into the care system. And, a large share of the long-term and community care is provided by relatives, friends, and the family carers. And so the informal care can substitute, for some of the home care services, as I mentioned, in terms of aged care. But the value, I guess, of unpaid care is often undermeasured in the standard economic measures, as GDP, for example, because it's not measured. And a colleague of mine from La Trobe University published this study called Hidden Workers by Age. Obviously, a lot of women in particular, are not counted for in terms of the workforce. And, most of these women do deliver what we call an informal care or caregiving. Next slide, please. Some of the emerging directions and future priorities. It's good that Carers Australia obviously has done, a number of national survey, and I think this is important to track people longitudinally in terms of their health and well-being across the life stages, because the care needs do change over time. So understanding the care journey is important, not only in terms of the long-term impacts, but also in terms of the investment on returns. Intersectionality in caring is important because we do have a diverse population, so understanding about how gender, culture, geography, and socioeconomic status shape carers' experiences is important. The other part is also about the use of digital and AI tools. So it's a lot out there at the moment, around AI, and definitely AI and technology can help support carers, in terms of reducing the burden, the strain, the demand, and also delivering a much more integrated and scalable support, particularly in underserved areas. The other part is around the policy and system redesigns. There needs to be an integration across the care systems because people do need to access various care systems, and aligning policies to proactively support carers prior to crisis for a much more sustainable care economy. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, some of the key insights, in the last 50 years is that carer research has strongly documented who the carers are, what they do, and how caring affects them. Evidence on effective support implementation and system integration, however, is less developed. So it's important to translate research into routine policy and practice. And also, in terms of the future work, there's a need to prioritize implementation, integration, evaluation, and measurable impact. So if I can move to the next slide, is a short video of one of my projects. So this is a video involving both the care recipients and the carers. And I would like to show this to you to highlight that, when we co-design, it's important to co-design not only with the care recipients, but also with the carers. So this is a project funded by the Australian government. It's about the dementia ecotourism respite program that we run in the rural communities.
I know, the social side of it, it's very nice, and nice people to sit and chat to and read your own issues and realise you're not alone.
Wonderful. And Trev, what do you like about coming to Green Connect? like the companionship and the stories we hear. And as a carer, it's good for me too to be involved.
Wonderful, wonderful. And if someone's perhaps a little bit hesitant about joining something like Green Connect, what advice can you give them?
I'd say don't be shy, come along and you'll certainly enjoy yourself.
What about you, Viv? Same?
Yeah, very similar. And you're also someone who can connect with someone who has the same issues as you. And that's a very good feeling because you know that you're not alone.
Wonderful.
So the last slide then, Lucas, thank you. So thank you very much, obviously, for listening. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Irene. That was a great overview where the research might be heading. It needs to head. And as a last but definitely not least speaker, we've got Alex. Thank you for coming. Alex will share his thoughts from a very different perspective, but probably from the most important perspective from the viewpoint of carers in New South Wales, which is as an actual carer. Welcome, Alex. Thank you for taking on this task on this very academic panel, and looking forward to hear your thoughts.
Lovely, no worries. Thank you very much, Lucas, and also thank you, Michael and Irene, for sharing your insights earlier. As Lucas said, my name's Alex. I am to set the scene, I'm a carer. I've supported family members through a number of both mental and physical health challenges for about 20 years. I haven't been alive for 50, so I can't really speak about a lot of the research that have happened, but I am very grateful for the opportunity to be on this panel today. I have, aside from being a carer, I have also been on the Carer Knowledge Exchange Steering Committee for a couple of years and been able to see firsthand a lot of the work that has been done, and I reckon they ought to be congratulated on a lot of the work that has happened. And finally, I am fortunate enough to now work in a lived experience role, which has also encompassed family and carers as well, to be able to give back to that lived experience outlook. I guess what I'm going to talk about today is in three parts: a little bit about what I have gone through previously, a little bit of thoughts about how research can support that systemic change around family and carers, and finally just a couple of bits about how I think lived experience can potentially inform research. So, like I said, I've been a carer for about 20 odd years for family members, physical health, mental health, but for a very long time, like Irene has mentioned several times, I had no idea that I was a carer. I just thought that, oh yeah, family member, got to do whatever you got to do to support your family. And I also came from an overseas culture where supporting your family is just something that you're supposed to do. You just do it. So I never even thought about, oh yeah, am I doing something that's additional to being a family? And my people and I kind of went on our journey for quite a number of years without getting really any support. You know, my family goes into hospitals for various things and then they get discharged. I just get asked, are you okay to take them back? And I'm like, yeah, of course I am. What am I going to do? Until I would say 15 years into that journey, somebody actually, like a clinician actually asked me at the end of a particular admission, how are you going yourself, Alex? Are you doing okay? Are you getting the support? And I was actually getting really taken aback by that question, because I was like, hang on, I'm not the one who's in distress here. I'm not the one who's undergoing issues. Why are you asking me? Spoiler alert, I absolutely was in distress. I had no idea about it at the time. I was just coping as much as I could. But anyway, thought that, oh yeah, that was nice. So I took up a lot of the information, which included carer support groups and other information to get into advocacy. And one thing led to another, and I did end up doing a couple of things with Carers New South Wales, amongst other organisations, and I'm very grateful for their support and being able to get involved in initiatives like this. So, and just having that awareness of what is possible, of having that community is, I thought it was incredible for my own well-being, for my own growth, finding out who I am. It's not just being a family and carer, but finding my own identity, so to speak. And eventually it led me to a place where I took up employment in carer lived experience roles within the public health system. And that was one of the most rewarding things that I've done. I previously also had a research background a number of years ago, but wasn't able to progress a lot with it because I wish that there was more in the system to support both myself and people in my life. But I absolutely do value the work of researchers and research in carers because I feel that it solidifies that systemic change that can impact a large number of people. Sure, on the one hand, when the clinician asked me how I was going, that was wonderful. That came out of a very good place. But I feel that we can't just rely on people having good intentions. Good intentions are great, but if it can be integrated into a systemic level where questions like these are put to carers on a regular basis as a part of how systems work, that would make it, well, the impact would be a lot more widespread than just simply rely on people's good intentions. And finally, I guess, I just want to share a couple of thoughts that I've had around how lived experience can inform research. And I think of it from 3 different levels, a little bit like what both Michael and Irene have shared, but I think of it as the impact of lived experience from an individual level, interpersonally, and on a systems level. So individually speaking, one of the questions that I get asked a lot as a lived experience worker is, everybody's got lived experience. What makes you special? No one actually says that, but the next line usually is along the lines of, what makes you special? Well, first of all, I don't think I'm anything special, but there is research to demonstrate that lived experience, yes, everybody has it, but what I call large L, large E lived experience involves being able to use our lived experience in a purposeful manner. For example, to tell our stories in a purposeful way, to serve a purpose of whether it be supporting people, whether it be to inform research, to inform systemic change. So it's that kind of, and those things require training, require a certain degree of refinement, so to speak. So to use lived experience purposefully, it's not just about telling stories to support other people, as important as that is, but it's also using it in a purposeful manner. That's on the individual, how lived experience is useful on an individual level. On an interpersonal level, I get a lot of feedback that lived experience stories generate a lot of resonance with people, and it helps that through design that Irene was talking about. In mental health, they have this catch cry called "Nothing About Us Without Us," and that came out of the early consumer movements that Michael was talking about in the 1970s. And also it informs being able to use our stories, our lived experience on interpersonally, also goes to supporting people's human rights and participation as citizens, as Michael has mentioned a number of times before. And finally, the way that I see lived experience being advantageous at a systems level, like I said before, it's nice to have good intentions, but when that good intention is embedded at a systems level, when it becomes matter of course almost into policies and implementations, that's where those impacts can really be multiplied, can really be applied consistently. And also, more importantly, it is to establish a kind of a scaffold, that kind of framework to ensure that there is trust and an evidence base within the system to ensure that those things, like I said, can be done consistently. That trust, that lived experience isn't just about telling stories or people coming out to say what their experiences are, but to generate, but to foster a more equitable system towards the people who are actually affected by the system can actually have a role in how the system's being designed and implemented. So I guess that's all I really got for now. I really look forward to interacting with Michael, Irene, and Lucas and the rest of the audience. And yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your reflections on what it means to be a carer and to bring that lived experience perspective to research around carers. To start off with the discussion, I would say just to refocus us, we heard a lot about systems, ecologies, history, the present, and how all these factors interact in a variety of ways. Maybe if we go around the room and start by mentioning sort of the one most important insight that you've gained through your academic or lived experience engagement with care or care research. What is the most important insight that for you that you have gained about care and about carers? And why is that? Has it changed something? Has it changed policy and practice? Has it changed yourself? Why don't you start us off, Michael?
Thanks very much, Lucas. That's just a big question, I suppose, in our fields.
Yeah,
the one. I mean, I suppose I'm going to just talk a little bit more broadly than just the one, because I think it is not just a single moment, but that there's. I suppose that the big impression that I've got is I think that Alex is onto something when he talks about lived experience, and I really have learned to listen to people, and we need to incorporate that in there. But I think the bigger question that I have is how we end up being in silos. Despite all this sort of attempt to try and say we live in a modern world, we've got so much communication technology surrounding us, so many opportunities to engage in shared messaging, it's just become so overwhelming. We realize that you actually can't spend your whole life on your phone. Even the people who are completely doom scrollers, as they call it, spend their days on it. Even they run out of time. And somehow or other, we end up with these silos. And I think that carers have ended up in something of a silo. It's an incredibly important and I suppose I've used the word inspiring. I don't want to continue to overuse it, but it's an incredibly important thing to acknowledge. But we need to think, well, once we've acknowledged it, what is our next step? And I think Irene went such a long way in doing that. I think that's my lasting impression that carers has caught in some sort of it's been success and its success has become its own biggest problem. Its success is that in Australia we have achieved a level of recognition which believe it or not, many countries overseas really are envious of. I first became aware of how much they envy us when I went to Canada, and Australia was, I thought, we were like Sweden or something, or like it was amazing. Oh, look what you've done in Australia. All of that. I thought, wow, I thought we were pretty backwards in Australia. United States have got no carers recognition system. Most European countries didn't really have much of a carers recognition system either, and neither does most of Asia. So I suppose you can say that's successful, but that's it. There's a carers advisory council. I was on the New South Wales Ministerial Advisory Council for over a decade, and that was interesting. We had a couple of dreadful ministers, let me tell you, and a couple of ministers that were pretty impressive. They were from, I was at the time of the National Part of the Liberals and National Party being in government. A couple of those were actually quite genuine about their engagement with carers. Most of the others felt they were time servers. They were wasting their time on the carers committee. They weren't helpful. But how do we break out of that silo and get into the bigger conversation? How do we, and I think Irene put it so well with her care ecology framework and documenting it. So that's the sort of thing. If I ask for a big message that I've learnt, that's what I've learnt. The smaller messages, but they're every bit as important and inspiring to me are those messages, as Alex said, from learning to speak to carers and the lived experience and my own experience of caring and caring within our family. I think it's been helpful for us, for me personally, but I think I've tried to share that with other members in the family. You know, we don't have this situation in my family of a single carer. We had a real care network. And too often, you know, the whole system reduces us to the one. So well, that's my attempt to address your question.
Thanks, Michael. Irene, how about you? What would you highlight as the most important insight?
Well, I think the most important thing for me is about, normalizing the care work itself and valuing the care work. Often what I see is that, people see the care is, oh, it's their job, it's not my job, and this is, particularly happen, and you can see in the gendered, I guess, workforce areas that, this is a women's job rather than it's a man's job. So I think that, and moving forward, I think, it's about the culture shift really is, around the thinking that, what makes us as a human being is that, we care or we care. We should be able to care. I mean, some people do not care, but I think that, normalizing the care as part of us, being the human being, normalizing care as part of the daily living. I think that is important because this is not, in the broader context, hence, like I'm looking at it from the ecosystem perspective, you're not just caring for yourself. Well, that's good. And you're not just caring for your loved ones, but, you do live within an ecosystem. If you work, you have your colleagues, at work, you're part of the community, where you live. So the care, I think, is not just limited to the actual care work itself. I think that, we need to normalize care as part of us being the human being. But as part of that, also understanding that, the care also needs to be valued. And I'm not just talking about everything needs to be costed, but, some of the part, particularly when we talk about, I guess, delivering very complex care, there needs to have, a training and support available. So I'm not against, for example, the partner delivering end-of-life care, at home. But what I'm trying to say is, which often happens is that, home-based care, and then the next thing is, you have carers with no support and no training, having to actually deliver somewhat a much complex care. And I think that is not fair. So this is what I'm trying to say in terms of normalizing care, but at the same time, really value the care work that people actually deliver in everyday life.
Thanks, Irene. I think there's an interesting intersection between Michael's observation of caring being recognized in itself and as a thing of itself and getting siloed in itself, and interaction, as you pointed out, with complexity and the fact that sort of to that position that the carer is in, the complexity gets put on there, and he then or they then have to mediate between other silos. And I think there's an interesting tension between siloing of carers and the silos that they interact with, and the complexity that they have to reduce in their everyday life. Alex, what would you think is for you the most important, the most impressive insight that you've gained over the years?
At the risk of sounding like a one-trick pony, I do think that lived experience is the incorporation of lived experience has been extremely important for me personally, but also in more recent research, especially in the last, I would say 10, 20 years, where I understand that a lot of funding bodies are also mandating the involvement of lived experience in their research, and building that into, like, so rather than it just being a nice thing to do, but building that into a systemic way of doing things, I think it is something that has both changed research itself, but also changed policy and practice. And once again, when I talk about lived experience, I don't just mean, getting people in, just asking them questions, telling stories, but also the associated training and culture change to support carers who have gone through their lived experience to be able to use their stories, to use their experiences in a purposeful way, to in whatever domain that they would like to engage in, whether they would like to support other people, whether they would like to inform policy or to get involved in research. There are different training and capabilities that can be built to enable people to do that. And also, I feel like having that lived experience helps breaking down those silos that Michael was talking about, and also helps that normalizing of that experience of daily care living that Irene was mentioning, because as much as people working within systems, they've got their constraints, they see within their silos. But for us on the ground, a lot of times we don't know how the systems interact. We don't know how silos there are. We just know that we've got a person at home to support, to look after. So having that experience to inform policy and research, I believe it's going to help at least letting policymakers know that those silos exist. Something needs to be done about it. Yeah, so that's what I think.
Thank you. And that's sort of a great, without having it planned, it's a great arch that we've already completed with the first round of questions, or the importance and the power of lived experience to, if properly integrated, to possibly reduce the silo-ness of the way that care is carried out. On a note that sort of looks a bit more at the negative side of things. In your experience, what's the other side of the coin? What is it that particularly research around carers has historically mostly overlooked or misunderstood? What is it that really needs, where perspective change really needs to happen? Irene, do you maybe want to start us off?
One of the big thing that I'm doing research on at the moment is around workforce. Obviously, I mentioned about this workforce shortage, particularly in Australia. But at the same time, I guess that, and I know CARES New South Wales, CARES Victoria and Western Australia obviously do have that program around employment. So I think that is important, particularly for women and in particular older women, often that, when they deliver care over a number of years, when they try to come back and join the workforce, often it's very difficult for them to enter the workforce. So I think that, one of the big, I guess, area or opportunity, I guess, in the future is look at this employment opportunity. So one of the areas of my research, for example, is looking at the informal caregiver training. And this is, part of, I guess, valuing the work that they do. A lot of the time, when you ask carers about, what do they do? I mean, people can't actually say, describe it or even quantify it. So what I'm trying to say is that, if you actually doing the caregiving for many, many years, you are doing a lot, a lot meanings, things from, like being the care navigator, being the care integrator, being the receptionist, the customer service, all of the above, the financial management, the driver and whatever. But what I'm saying is, though, it's not being recorded, it's not being recognized, it's not being valued. So my research at the moment is looking at, is there a way we can better train people and also, I guess, document the kind of work that people do over time with the view of actually, enable people to actually, I guess, gain employment out of that. Because, it is care work and it is actually a type of work that, unrecognized and unvalued. And I think we need to change that. But that's just my personal, I guess, pet projects at the moment.
Thanks, Irene. Yeah, so it's interesting, sort of this intersection, and as you say, this misunderstood intersection between work and care, and care not seen as part of work, despite all the recognition that it supposedly gets. But yeah, so it's a very interesting point to sort of look at it, say, no, care is work.
Care is work, yeah.
Yeah, Michael, do you want to continue on?
Yeah, well, that's a great point. I suppose something that I think that we probably need to confront a little bit more too is the hostility towards carers. Okay, there is a hostility that, and there's, I suppose, alongside the hostility, I wanted to actually put that as part of sort of addressing the sort of, let's call it the dark side of care. We've had several articles in our journal over the dark side of care. In fact, we actually just released a special issue on the dark side of care, which is interesting. But why I mean hostility, the disability movement has taken a broad hostility to carers. And the reason they say they've taken this position, it came, as far as I can trace, it came initially from a number of the American disability advocates who were themselves disabled, but often disabled due to accidents later in life. So they'd experienced an independent life, and they didn't want somebody nannying them all their life, all their time, telling them what they should do and shouldn't do. And so they picked this idea that we don't want a carer, we want an employee who does what we tell them to do. You know? And this is something that you think, oh, that's America. Well, that's quite the core of the NDIS in Australia. That's quite central, and that's one of the reasons why not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why the NDIS has really hit sort of the wall on problems, partly because carers were excluded. And if you think in particular of mental health issues, and you think in particular of autism, and you think of children, while they're disabled of all types, but particularly autism spectrum disorders in childhood, that to try and exclude the parents and try and exclude carers from that discussion has been disastrous for the NDIS. And you can measure that disaster in billions and billions of cost overruns and expenses that are probably misdirected expense, but just also unproductive and sad cases. I think we need to make this a little bit more central to our work, not just oppose it. I think some of it is true. Why I say I want to link that to the dark side of caring is sometimes caring goes bad. And we do know, just to take another thing, the Commissioner for Ageing and Disability in New South Wales publishes an annual report. And in the annual report, they document problems, in particular where carers have gone berserk trying to take all the rights away from the person that they're caring. It often starts with financial issues, so they tend to be kids who have found difficulty getting a job and they want to have the parents, they move in with their parents, then they want to have the control of the car, then they want control of the house. And so they're using the language of the Commissioner for Disability and Ageing is using the language of coercive control from domestic violence. And it's a quite correct description. And we need to talk a lot more about that. Not to say, oh, isn't it threatened if you don't give us more money? You know, this is what you're going to get, more coercive control. But we almost think, oh, that's not what care is about because we're on the warm and fuzzy side of it. So I think to acknowledge this sort of dark side of caring in particular, but also particularly this hostility and the difficulty that comes from that position of the disability movement, to work with the disability movement. I don't think we need to work against them. I don't really think in Australia there is the deep-seatedness is a different feature, but I think we need to probably work closely with them, just as we need to work with other organisations such as the ageing representative organisations, not just COTA, but Senior Australia and combined superannuant pensioners and superannuants and so forth. We need, and OPAN has been fantastic, and you do work with them, but I think they're real issues for us.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it's a hard thing to talk about very often, and the tension between autonomy and care, not just, as you mentioned, with the relation between carer and care recipient, or the person being cared for, but also the autonomy that the carer has themselves. There's an important, I think, under and often misunderstood insight. Thank you, Michael, for bringing it up.
Well, thank you.
Alex, what do you think is the biggest misunderstanding around care?
I think the relational nature of care that both Michael and Irene have spoken about before is something that has been in research for a number of years now, but still not quite translated to at a systems level. I just from my own journey around supporting other carers, a phrase that I hear a lot is, I'll be better if my person gets better. So in other words, their person and the carer themselves are seen, like the carer see that as two completely separate entities. I'm not going to get better until my person actually gets better. And in order to cope, for some of those carers to cope, unfortunately, they have taken on a kind of that trolling narrative that Michael was talking about, has taken on use, whether it be systemic instruments or their own mindset in trying to control the situations. And there's been research into social work literature in the early 2010s that looks at whether care, there's a number of ways that systems have been looking at carers, whether it be people who need support themselves or as a kind of a hindrance to the person or to their person's recovery. So there is that kind of, that trying to understand that caring is a relational aspect where family and carers also, while they're providing support for their person, but they are also undergoing a kind of transformation for themselves, supporting carers to support their person's autonomy, which goes back to that aspect of human rights that Michael mentioned earlier, I mentioned earlier. I understand that the whole notion of supported decision making has been discussed variously at federal and state levels. So that understanding around how carers and people they're supporting are in this relational recovery together rather than being separate entities. I think there is still work to be done in that area for that to be understood. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. I find it quite surprising from the point of a facilitator how almost frighteningly well the topics seem to align and the perspectives seem to align around the questions of autonomy, of what it means to be a carer in a world that values work, but where the different silos reduce autonomy. You're not in the silo of work that gets ascribed the value. So I am actually quite surprised how well and how coherent the viewpoints of our panelists are around these issues, which begs the question, and sort of that wasn't planned, but sort of what then are the obstacles for systemic change? What then are the obstacles that we need to overcome to actually make these positive changes happen, to give the carer the autonomy that they need, to give the carer the recognition that they need, to give the person that requires care the care that they need, and to really create a better life for all involved? What are the obstacles that need to be overcome? Michael, do you want to start?
I mean, this is such a big question, Lucas. It is just vast. But let me just start with the first and simplest one to tackle. It's not really simple to bring about the changes, but it is simple to imagine it. And that is that it starts with thinking. This is the role of thinking in social science and in social activism and in social responses such as the Carers Association. We need to think first. And I think the first thing is to really talk about these issues more amongst ourselves and think how we're going to operate. We start to need to recognise it. Unless you recognise it, it doesn't happen. So just as the world for thousands of years, most of the people in the world thought the world was flat because it just appears to be flat. That's the way it talked about lived experience. That's our experience until they sent astronauts up. There were people in the world who were skeptical that the world was a globe. And even people have said, oh, you're faking it. It's Hollywood. Once it's gone up, as it turns out. So I think lived experience has its problem in that the lived experience itself is shaped by our beliefs. We see the world not really as it is, but as we understand it to operate. So we need to start thinking about these things first. And I think once we've done that, then we can start working out, well, what are the ways in which we can approach it? So the good thing is the answer isn't just money. It won't hurt to have a little bit of money thrown in there, but we're not asking for millions and millions of unpayable tax dollars or money from elsewhere, but we are asking for a different set of a different configuration, to pick up a bit of the idea of this care into ecosystem. I think the concept of a care ecosystem is great, except with one limitation, that the care ecosystems are sort of should be left alone. Your ecosystems you don't want to interfere in too much. And I think we do want something that we can interfere in somehow or other. So, this care, this I call it social division of care. We do need to think of how we can respond to the social division of care more effectively. And we used to laugh. I remember we used to laugh when I was 30, 40 years ago about Italian hospitals and so forth. Italian hospitals had nurses to do medical things, but family used to come in and feed the patients, and wash them and change the sheets. And we all thought how ridiculous that was. And yet, in a sense, that's what goes on with our carers world. How do we link these worlds much more thoroughly? That does involve recognition. It does involve extending our idea of what work is beyond just employment to unpaid work that care involves. It does involve the recognising the rights of carers to a decent world. It does acknowledge, I suppose, yet another concept. This is a simple but a big one, the word carer. Even the word we use to describe things. If you talk to a person outside of this discussion, what does a carer mean? And they'll tell you that they mean a care worker. That's what a carer is, somebody who gives paid care. They don't think of it as unpaid care at all. There's so many different dimensions, but I do think it starts with thinking our way through the problem first and understanding that problem at a sort of a conceptual level, and then working out what the dimensions are. So, once we get in there, there are the political dimensions and all of these other conceptual ones. And how does it work in this world of technology? Technology that both enables us to communicate, but then gives us all these sort of little worlds of our own, the echo chambers that the communication technology has created, rather than a worldwide web, as we'd hoped, that would draw us closer together. It's divided us, and that's a real problem, that division. So all of those things are there.
Okay, a new mindset is surely a good start to overcome the problems that we face. Alex, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. A new mindset, that's definitely what we're trying to go for here. It seems like the mindset that I'm thinking about is actually about psychological safety. I feel like there's still a lot of imbalance in power between systems, quote unquote, whatever you want to call it, and people who actually use the system. So whether or not people are as forthcoming about the challenges that they face, and even just recognizing themselves as carers, like both Michael and Irene, you both just said, if people aren't going to feel psychologically safe, they're not going to come out and even acknowledge it, let alone challenging stigma, let alone letting the system know this is what's happening. And I feel like there is a lot of space for that empowerment of that lived experience. And by that, I don't mean systems empowering people. I really believe that people need to be given the space and the ecosystem to get empowered themselves, because the system shouldn't be empowering people, it should be people empowering themselves. And Michael, you were saying that people should be recognizing our own perspectives, because that's what shapes lived experience. We all come with our own perspectives. I absolutely agree with that. And that's why I feel like part of that empowerment involves upskilling people with that lived experience to recognize those holistic issues, to be able to contribute into a system where many, many different people come with many, many perspectives. So I feel that psychological safety, equalizing that power and empowering lived experience through whether it be education, cultural change, are probably you're asking about obstacles. It sounds like I'm actually talking about how to overcome those obstacles. So I'm sorry for muddling the questions, but that's what I got.
Yeah. So if I might say something, that's a very good word you're using, power. And it's a word that we haven't been using, and we probably do need to use it. And I meant to say this earlier. I think that was a really good point of the feminist approach, that they recognize, the personal is political. I think we do need to recognize the politics is inherent in the world. You need politics. Politics is about negotiating and working out rules of behavior and governance and punishment and control. Politics is, you can't avoid it. And yet we manage to avoid it nearly all the time in the carers movement, as we sort of step over into the ethical domain and talk about ethics without a politics, and often an ethics without economics too. That, and getting both the economics and the politics involved in our discussion is part of recognizing that power issue that you're talking about there, Alex. I've really valued what you've got to say. Thank you. You've been terrific.
Thanks, Michael. And Irene, to you, so that the big obstacle and how to overcome it.
I think Michael mentioned this. I think it's about the identity. If you ask people on the street, and you mentioned the word carers, they all think about the workforce. And most of them think about the workforce, meaning the low-level workforce. So your personal care workers, the community health workers. No one would identify when you say you are a carer. No one would identify that as being, an informal caregivers. So I come across it quite a lot. So what I want to say is, I know people do not like America at the moment. So, but this is an example I want to give. 3 years ago, I did my sabbatical in geriatric oncology. So one part of my research is around older people with cancer. So I visited 8 cancer centers across North America, so US and Canada, what strikes me is, I guess the point of difference in terms of how care is being delivered there. This is a top end, I guess, a cancer center in America. Okay, so it's not your normal usual one, but what I see as an innovative or innovation is that they actually value the informal caregivers, being the care partners. So they deliberately use that word, care partners. And in every single medical encounters, that I sit in, I did observe the clinical interaction, is that, they always ask the patients, they give patients the choice. Do you want to have, your care partners to come along with you? And then, if they said yes, the care partners actually have a badge. So it's clearly identified, when they run these multidisciplinary meetings, so you got the physios, you got the oncologists, and whatnot, right? That, this is the patient and this is the care partners. And the care partners, unlike in Australia, they're actually being heard and they can ask questions. So this is that power of the one that, Alex is talking about, That's not happening here in Australia, though. Even to this day, if I observe, and I do quite a lot of clinical research, in the hospitals settings, or even in primary care, unless you're talking about children or even to a degree, I guess, people with disability. But, if it's an adult, or even people with dementia, often the caregivers are actually not being valued, not being identified, and there seems to be a lot of reluctance, I guess, amongst the care provider to actually have the discussion, and this happens in a memory clinic, with the carers, because they were saying that, well, we need to deliver a person-centered care, which is well and truly good. But what I'm saying, though, that, the carers, play a critical role to actually make the care being delivered. So if you do not engage, and give, some power to the carers, the care itself will not happen. But that's I guess that identity, and colleagues of mine in America even developed this care badge, so people can actually have, this is the badge, like looks like a sheriff sort of badge, so that it's identifiable that, hey, I'm a carer, I have a lived experience as being a carer. So it's part of this, I guess, revolution, if you like, transformation or reform, to actually not only identify the carers, but also value them.
Thank you. And I think that's a very specific and a very great transition again to opening up to questions that we received from our audience. A very specific measure, really identifying the carers in the place of clinical care and involving them through identification and through a mandatory involvement that is anchored in policy. That brings me to the question that Angela asked in the chat, which was, from your research, what's the one systemic shift that would most improve outcomes for carers in the next 5 years? So moving away from the mindset and the big ideas to the very specific policy shift. Irene, you mentioned some of these examples in your last statement. Would you like to add to them or mention something else?
So I've mentioned in my response to Angela, I think, to me it's about that, normalizing the care and also valuing the care. So I think that, this identification of carers, I think, is quite problematic in Australia. I think the word itself, I think people in Australia use the word carers, but, outside Australia, because I wrote quite a lot of books, I'm sure you're the same as well, Michael, people use the term caregivers.
Yep.
And then care partners, I think, more recently. In any case, I think, there needs to be a clear definition. I'm not against anything. The same with people don't like to be called consumers versus whatever. Look, depends on the settings, Some people do not like to be called patients, But to me, it depends on the setting or the context. I mean, some people are patients, if you are, the consumer of a health service, for example. So what I'm trying to say is, I think having that clear definition and identification, I think, Lucas, to respond to Angela, I think would be very important first step, I think.
Yeah.
Michael, your thoughts on the one change that needs to happen to really improve carers within the next 5 years?
All right, being very concrete and realistic, I think it's something that we've already achieved in the New South Wales health system, believe it or not, and that was one of the things that I thought we were most productive with through the Carers Advisory Council. There was representatives of the Ministry of Health there, and I was one of the people, there was several of us who raised this issue. Why aren't carers identified in the data collected on every patient admitted to the hospital? Well, they are now. New South Wales was the first state in Australia, and as far as they could see, the first place in the world to make it required that they actually document who provides care outside of that setting, because often they'll put for example, with somebody with AIDS in the past, they'd put their family member, and their family member might have been condemning them because they were gay and they'd done sinful things and so forth. And the person who's their partner is not visible on the notes. No one knew who they were. So if you look at the data from New South Wales Health, you see a very different picture of caregiving to what we see in most of the other pictures. So I think that I'd like to see that requirement extended to both all government departments, and it should be, of course, for things like Centrelink. Sounds a bit much, and there's sometimes you need to have a note. Is this appropriate? You would need some safeguards around that too, because there are times when the caregiver and the care recipient have different interests and so forth. So it's not simple, but I think that's quite achievable and quite a first step forward, and then you can start saying, well, we would like to see along with that this idea of implementing the idea of a care partner. I think that Irene's given us the vocabulary actually, and I really thank you so much, Irene. That's the term. Care partner works reasonably well for me for the moment. Caregiver does work well, much as we like, and we reckon that's not to diminish the world of the care of the contribution of Carers New South Wales or Carers Australia, but imagine we were called caregivers. Would that damage us? Wouldn't hurt. And care partners would be one of the core groups of caregivers.
Yeah.
That wouldn't hurt, would it?
I mean, the
And that's
formulation
achievable.
carers as partners in care is in every Care Recognition Act, I believe.
Yeah. Well,
Alex,
that's it. We need to have the Carers Recognition Acts amended. We'd also need to link them into some sort of enforceable rights while we're at it. But that's perhaps I've had my one go. So,
Alex.
Believe it or not, I actually wrote your last words, Michael, actually is exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say that the embedding of human rights into policies and legislations. I wrote it down, so I'm not cheating on this one. But yeah, on the one hand, it is still going to be a system where things are it has been traditionally a system where things are being done to people, whether it be to carers, to patients, to consumers. A system where people can walk alongside each other, exactly like that terminology that Irene was saying, care partners versus caregivers, recognizing that carers and people who receive care walk alongside each other, and each one of them has got their own individual set of human rights. And I think it goes with a wider human rights action that has been brewing, I believe, for the last couple of years to enshrine human rights into New South Wales legislations. So I think if we're talking about a 5-year time frame, I think that can happen on a larger level, but at the very least to recognise that in the carers world. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. Again, I am impressed by sort of how well this all fits together. It seems like there is a large overlap in the opinions on what needs to happen next. There is one question in the chat for Irene, but I might open it up to everyone. So Irene, an anonymous attendee, asked about the relational dynamic that you mentioned in your ecosystem model of care, and how we could position that better in the work with providers, in the work with, and I guess that sort of expands on the last question that you answered, where you gave the example with the identifying care is surely the first step, but how could sort of this relational aspect of care that also goes, I guess, into the discussion of autonomy that we had before with Michael and Alex, how could we use that better in the work with providers?
So thanks for the questions, and it also relates to, I think, the last questions. I think is it Maureen? I think asked about the about mental health, and then the carers often excluded. To me, that from my research at least, what I can see is that there are three roles of carers, in terms of the models of care, like how carers can contribute. Obviously, the way I see it, and as you can see in that the care ecosystem framework that I'm proposing is that, there's a lot of interdependencies within the care, not only in terms of the setting or the sectors, a lot of the sectors are interrelated, whether it's aged care, mental health, disability and whatnot. So that's one part, but also in terms of these days, I guess, the more complex conditions you have, then the more, I guess, disciplines that you need to work with, the more care providers that you need to work with. So again, that's part of these interdependencies. And then that's related to the system, that relates to the funding, and so on. So what I'm trying to say is, and what I like about, the ecosystem framework is that, we need to understand that this thing does not sit in isolation, the care itself or the person itself. There's a lot of interdependencies. So in terms of the three roles for the carers, I guess, in terms of the model, one is, as I mentioned about the care partners. So the carers having having the role to be the co-decision maker in terms of, how care is being delivered. As the care partner, the carers also be the co-manager of the treatment and then daily care. And the second part is as a care integrator. So they're the one who, I guess, pick up the pieces. And this is where in my last slide, I said, without the carers, there's no care system. Because the care systems, systems depend on the carers. So without the carers, the care systems will not run full stop. So being the care integrator, some of the roles that I could see for the carers is to connect the dots, connects the services, the multiple services, multiple providers. So ensures the care continuity. Continuity, I think you've heard the term care continuity. So it's not just only in terms of accessing the same providers, but also making all of this multidiscipline, works together. And the other part of that care integrator is also to fill the system gaps. As I mentioned, if you are eligible for the support at home, but then you need to wait for 12 months. So it means that you being the informal caregivers, you need to actually deliver that care in the meantime. So you fill in the gaps. The third roles, I guess, in the model is being the care recipient themselves. And this is where, part of my research is looking at the health and well-being of the carers themselves. I think most carers do not care about themselves. But, I'm trying to argue and challenge that, they themselves, are a person, a human being, and they themselves, often is also a care recipient in their own right. So that means that, they also require some support, assessments, training, as I mentioned before. And they also need to have, their independence and the well-being needs to be met.
Thank you. That is a good final word. I'm really sorry that we have actually run out of time kind of with this session. It was a very fruitful discussion. I would like to whip around for a quick 1-2 sentence final word for everyone. What was What is your takeaway? What is the one sentence that everybody should remember from this session? Starting with you, Michael.
Oh, you're tough. You're tough. I think there's a lot to be proud of, but our job isn't done. We need to keep working on this, and that we can achieve a lot from a little initiative from, Claire Stevenson's initial work in Sydney back in 1973 and 74, when she was sort of thinking this through, and now 1976 it's become a big movement that's now international in dimension. We can also think of ourselves as having a potentially also strong role, and we need to be optimistic we can do things, but we need to be ambitious. We need to be ambitious. That's my takeaway. Continue the work.
Thank
Build
you.
on it.
Irene, do you have one final sentence for a takeaway from the session?
Well, I'll put it in my slide there. So I still believe that, without carers, there will be no healthcare or social care systems.
Thank you. And Alex?
Yeah, I do believe that absolutely there is work to do, and we can do it, and that individual carers can absolutely make a difference, not just to the people in our lives, but in our system. But it's going to need structure, need framework, need scaffolding, so we can do this.
Thank you all very much for this very engaging first session of this year's symposium. We are now going to lunch break, and I would like for everybody who attended the session, please join us at 12:45 for the Early Career Researchers Forum, where we will look at how the next generation of researchers is tackling these problems. We will look at very specific systemic insights, very specific practice insights throughout the 5 presentations and the discussion in the afternoon. Thank you so much. We are going to lunch break, and have a good rest of the day. Please, I hope to see you later.